Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today we are joined again by Keith Preston, Swithun Dobson, and Ruminations. And this is 2020. Anything that can happen apparently did happen. We had a coronavirus pandemic outbreak. We had the government try to shut down the economy. We had the left-wing Democratic civil war between Bernie bros and Biden bros. We had, an attempt to the end of 4 years of trying to undo Trump's election by the Democratic Party. And so the questions out there are, everybody's talking about civil war or some sort of civil disturbance that tears the country apart. Some people might already say it's already happening, like in the inner cities. But what is that going to look like? Will there be an election this year in the United States, given the shutdown, given the political instability? Will there even be a Democratic National Convention? Will it look more like 1968? Will the government shut down the economy for the rest of the year, as well as schools? So we're just going to sort of explore these ideas and make some general thoughts and predictions about what we think is plausible. So we'll start with you, Keith. What do you think the rest of 2020 is going to look like for the United States?
Well, I guess the first question is the rest of 2020 going to last? I'm still waiting for the asteroid or the space invaders to come or whatever. So I guess that would be the first thing. But it's hard to say because there's just so many variables that are involved in this whole set of circumstances. We're basically living through the Spanish flu and the '68 uprising and the Great Depression, and the Dust Bowl and all these other things, and Watergate all rolled into one. So who knows what's going to happen when you have that many variables. I would be surprised if there was not an election this year, because the electoral system is such a fundamental part of the states or the ruling classes' self-legitimation system. I mean, if the powers that be want to maintain at least a veneer of legitimacy, they have to have some sort of functional, consistent, procedural mechanism that continues to convey that legitimacy over an extended period of time. I don't think they want to give that up that easily. As far as the outcome of the election, that's extremely hard to say, because you have on one hand Donald Trump being Donald Trump, and then his opponent is a guy that obviously has dementia and that his party is trying to hide from the voters. So that's a somewhat unusual situation. So who knows how that's going to turn out in terms of who's going to win. Incumbents always have the advantage. It's clear that Trump is trying to work the law and order Nixon card in response to the civil unrest that's happened. At the same time, polls show that Trump is way behind, much further so than he was in 2016. And it also, we have to look at the changing demographics as well that continue to make against the Republican Party. In the last 4 years, there's been a whole new wave of 18 to 22-year-olds who've come of voting age and things like that. So, and then, of course, there's a question of what is voter turnout going to be like, because of the pandemic, and that, which doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon, at least in the United States. A lot of people are going to be hesitant to come out to vote. However, the election turns out, I suspect both sides will insist that it was a fraudulent election. If Trump wins re-election, I'm sure the left is going to go crazy. We'll probably see another wave of riots. I think if the Democrats win, there's going to be accusations of voter fraud and all the accusations of that type that are made by the Republican side in some instances. So the point being is that whatever side wins, I don't think the other side is going to accept the legitimacy of the election. Now, that doesn't mean the election is going to be nullified or canceled. I've seen articles in recent days about the situation in Portland and in Chicago and places like that. And people from the left are saying, well, Trump is imposing martial law. He's building the infrastructure for a dictatorship. And to which I would respond, no. When he wanted to send the army out to suppress the riots when they initially started, Mark Esper, supposedly Trump's subordinate, actually vetoed that. I think that shows that presidents are just managers. That ultimately they they succeed or fail when those behind them want them to succeed or fail. But other than that, I don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, I do think it's going to be extremely contentious as far as the election. I think that the pandemic is going to continue to play out in all sorts of unpredictable ways. And I don't see the economy getting better. In fact, I see it getting worse. It seems like there are tens of millions of people now that are on the verge of homelessness. And the civil unrest, it seems like that continues to go back and forth and flare up and then die down and flare up again. And I suspect there'll be a lot more of it if Trump wins re-election.
Yeah, Rumination. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have mixed thoughts on the direction in which things are going, because on the one hand, there's no doubt that things have become much more dramatic than could have ever been expected over the past 4 years. It's just one thing after another, Russia Gate, the impeachments, then the coronavirus, then the riots, and now the virus again. It seems to me like this has largely been a strategy for delegitimizing Trump's administration. Actually, I heard a good analysis by Colin Liddell not long ago that whether they're trying to make Trump look bad or good, or themselves look good, it seems like the ultimate purpose of all of this is to say, well, Trump is the chaos candidate. Whether it's our fault, whether it's his fault, whether it's us bullying you into voting for us, or whether he's causing it all, the point is that that for 4 years your life has been nothing but unrest. Vote for us and we'll make it stop. I think that's kind of the feeling in the air. So that it sort of leads to the question of, well, what would happen if he either got elected again, or someone like Joe Biden took his place? Would they be able to put all of this back in the bottle again? I think that, on the other hand, there are some things that are calming down. That is, if you look at the kind of transgender radicalism, or the real core of social justice, identity politics, the way that it felt in 2016, it's clear that a lot of that did not catch on to the extent that it may have been intended to. So I think that the elites are of two minds. On the one hand, they want to delegitimize this entire Trump populist phenomenon, but they also want to be able to put the genie back in the bottle whenever it suits them. It reminds me of what Hans Hermann Hoppe said about not why the elites don't just invite, why don't they just open the borders and invite millions and millions of migrants in. And it's because they don't want to actually delegitimize their own system. They don't actually want to do anything that would cause it to crumble overnight. And it's for that reason that I think an election will take place. This is not dissimilar to the observation that Keith has made, that they would not risk forestalling an election, because that would ultimately delegitimize them, for the same reason that they wouldn't want to completely open the borders, because that would delegitimize them. What they want is a manageable progression of this managerial, democratic, multicultural state. But they want to do it with themselves in charge, and they want to do it in a way that maintains the stability of the hegemony. So it's for that reason that I think that I get the sense, I have very little to justify this, but I get the sense that somebody is thinking that at some point things will need to calm down, or else the entire nation is going to fall apart. And this is based on the patterns that we've seen in the past. That is, if you look at, say, the 60s or the 70s, and sort of radicalism then, leading into the 1980s, yes, there were attempts to delegitimize or cast aspersions on Reagan. But on the other hand, there was a sense in which things were meant to be kept tame. They were meant to be sort of packaged in a way that maybe they could kind of buy off Reagan, or maybe they could sort of turn it into something that had more long-term viability. So I think that if you look at the phenomenon that is right-wing populism, and then you look at the phenomenon that is social justice, the riots, the left as it exists now, I think that is going to be a difficult time for for the elites to repackage this, to say, how can we take all of this and brand it as something manageable that we can then enforce as the status quo going forward. That's difficult because of demographic differences. It's different because you have all of these wild college students running around. It's difficult because of the internet. There are any number of things that are keeping society from taking all of these changes and digesting them. But I do think that there is an effort to do that, an effort to sort of buy off right-wing populism while also buying off the radical left. Like, I really do think if you look at these corporations, right, you look at the Republican Party, you look at any number of nominally left-wing or right-wing mainstream institutions, they want to take these radicalisms and then turn them into something boring and normal. And I think it's taking a lot longer for them to do it than in the 80s, because the things that they're trying to brand as their own are so much more dramatic and radical. But I do think that effort may pay off for a short amount of time, and that may begin with the election. So I do think that there will be an election, and I think there will at least be an attempt to make things revert to some degree of boredom or normalcy, where they just say, well, this is what we always believed, and the Republicans can kind of take over populism and neutralize it, and the progressives can kind of take over the radical protest left and say, well, this was always us, and so we have these now contained within these neat, manageable brands. Now, that, I think, is what they will ultimately try to do. Now, whether it will work very smoothly or not is another question.
All right, Swithun, your thoughts?
I agree that there'll definitely be an election. I simply don't see how there couldn't be, for the reasons I've outlined so far. And it would be interesting to see how long lockdown policies as such continue until whoever wins in November. And as a side, despite Trump, now I haven't looked at the polls too closely, I just simply don't see Biden winning. I think I've mentioned that before. He's just he's senile, as Keith has pointed out, and I find it difficult to see that the Trump voters who did vote for Trump the last time will vote for Biden this time, who switched over in the swing states. There are some younger people who will vote, but the proportion of young people who vote who are between like the ages of 18 and 25 is relatively small. So it may be enough to turn a state blue, but I'd be doubtful of that. What I think is interesting with respect to 2020 as a whole is the lockdown policies, whilst it seems to be deliberately pointed towards trying to unseat Trump in certain ways as domestic disorder, most countries in the world have followed a sort of lockdown policy of some description. And the big question is why? Why is there so much coordination? Maybe it's the World Health Organization and everyone wants to follow what they're doing. Or it may just be a manifestation of the reality that we basically live in one global system in which the elites in most of the countries follow the similar policies. I mean, politically, it's interesting to compare the US and the UK in this context. Boris Johnson won the biggest Tory victory since 1987 in the election in December. And politically is effectively at present unassailable, yet has followed exactly the same course. But again, though, similar with Johnson as with Trump, it seemed to be the establishment behind the scenes who are the ones who are pushing it. I predict, so why are they doing this? It is a disease and it does have its problems, although I do think that the main thing that's happened here is elites have exploited the pandemic to enrich their own economic interests. I mean, if you look at the whole bailout funds and the way in which that's going to be operating, what you're going to see is a much greater concentration in all markets. The small players are just going to have to be, they simply can't survive in the current economic climate. You have the Federal Reserve and also the Bank of England who are buying corporate bonds. I mean, basically, they are making it significantly cheaper for large corporations who are public limited companies to borrow, to spend, to keep themselves afloat. Which is simply just not available to any small players. You're going to increase in market concentration. You can guarantee that the billionaires, etc., will come out of this much better than everybody else will. One theory I heard with respect to that, and I'd need to look more closely into it, is the idea that the paper money system as currently constituted is less than stable ever since 1971, since Nixon went off gold. And they need some form of replacement, which is why with the whole coronavirus of I don't know if in America, the craziness about how coronavirus could be spread on cash. I don't know if you had that. Ever since the 2008 recession, there's been a war on cash, because it means that you can have anonymous payment, and you can and it also means that if you didn't like the banks or whatever, you can take your money out and pay in cash. I think one of the moves is to try to go to a cashless society, which would be much more controllable, and the safety valve that people have to take money out of large banks to keep the monetary system going will disappear, so they'll have entire monetary control. So I see that move continuing beyond 2020. I think even if Biden wins, I still think lockdown policies may well be continued, and at least the increase in state power, which has accompanied it, will continue. I mean, I can see the UK, for example. We've recently had the mandate to now wear face coverings in shops when there's barely any cases now, and they gave 2-week notice because it was so serious. Things like this, I think they'll probably keep them for quite a long time, and they'll continue to do that. So I suspect they might do that even in the Biden win, just because it's an extension of state power, and that'd be fine. And plus, all the Democrats probably like it anyway. Will there be civil unrest? Whoever wins, there's probably going to be more civil unrest if Trump wins, but civil war, I think, is highly unlikely. Although I suppose that's basically my view that, despite Trump being in power, his power is actually relatively constrained as a president, and him being able to turn America into a fascist regime, in quotes, is simply just isn't really there in any meaningful sense. And the leftist agitators care more about identity, despite what Right Rumination said about SJWism. That still seems to be very very prominent, and much more so than the economic issues. I mean, the BLM stuff shows that to some extent. And I don't know if you came across an interesting case in the UK recently. There's I think she's Indian academic at Cambridge University, who kept tweeting out how to abolish whiteness, etc., etc. And now she's been promoted to a full professorship. And then you have a situation in which David Starkey, an eminent historian, says that slavery couldn't have been a genocide because so many damn blacks survived, at which point he was then castigated across the mediums and was had all his book contracts ripped up by HarperCollins, etc., because he said damn blacks. Despite what I think Tyler Cowen claimed, that there would be the end of SJWism effectively, and progressivism, I think was sorely incorrect, and still seems to be so. So I see the march for SJWism and corporate capitalism. I say I don't see the left as any real, genuine force on economic issues, and therefore can be placated by the left. The right complain, but they aren't really militant enough to do anything. I mean, you have the anti-lockdown stuff. I can't remember, in Colorado. and some of the militia movement, but they're simply too small to make any difference. And if Biden wins, they'll complain about voter fraud, we'll just carry on as normal. So yes, there may be increasing tensions, but what we will see is a widening of class divisions and a further enrichment of the elite.
I think one plausible reading of the electoral process, assuming that it's going to happen, and I think it probably will. I mean, if it doesn't, then we'll have a lot more problems than what we have now to deal with, is that the ongoing civil war between the more radical elements of the Democratic Party, which we saw in the beginning of this year, like Tulsi Gabbard, Andrew Yang, and Bernie, are going to continue because a lot of them are really upset that the establishment candidate Biden, who they didn't want, got elected or got chosen by the party. And then, of course, Yang and Tulsi and Bernie all had to make their obligatory "we support Biden," which sort of makes them look like they denied everything they stood for in the run-up. And that, I think, indicates that something like the DNC of 68 might be the case. Certainly there'll be a lot of security at the DNC this year. And the fact that Biden really isn't running, that's kind of surreal, having a presidential election where one candidate isn't really running. Of course, because he is senile, and every time he opens his mouth, he says something crazy. There was a discussion over whether he would have debates with Trump. And the problem is, so many Americans expect televised debates, since the Kennedy-Nixon debate. And to not do that would be a massive vote of no confidence on the part of the Democratic Party. They would want to not do that, but I'm not sure they can afford to not do that, because if they don't allow Biden to debate, then it's pretty much saying that we don't have a candidate. So I think they're going to have to. But, what that would look like, it'd be a circus. I mean, Biden versus Trump. I guess the one thing you could say in Biden's favor is he's so senile and so out of it that it would be hard for Trump to get a rise out of him, because, he's not even going to know what Trump is attacking. And as far as the polls saying Trump is losing, I mean, after 2016 and how they said Hillary was going to win by a landslide, I don't really know how much we can trust these polls anymore. And furthermore, a lot of these people aren't talking about the stream of people leaving the Democratic Party. Moderates who either didn't vote or voted Democrat in 2016 are trending towards Trump now, or at least they were, say, from January to June. And a lot of Democrats were walking away with, the hashtag walk away movement. And how many of those people are just not being mentioned? So, for example, with social media like Twitter, we see what a lot of the more radical elements of the U.S. political process are standing for. But like Twitter users are like 2% of the population. What does the average American think? And the closest thing we have to a barometer for the average American, I think, is Tucker Carlson, because he's the most popular news show ever. And I feel like if Tucker's that popular, then that means there's a lot of popular discontent, across the spectrum against the sort of chaos and anarchy that's been going on. And in fact, with all the crime in New York City, prominent Black leaders have come out saying, bring the police back. We're tired of the shootings. So, how much of this will backfire on them in the long run? I think short of massive fraud or complete breakdown of the civil institutions, I don't see how Trump can't win re-election, because the Democrats really aren't running a candidate anyhow, really. Keith, what are your thoughts on that sketch for the election?
Well, I definitely think the debate issue is a big dilemma for the Democrats, because I'm sure their strategists are really dreading the idea of having to put Biden on camera for 2 hours while Trump takes pot shots at him. I mean, that's not going to portray them very well. Although I tend to look at it like, at this point, I think the society itself is polarized, that hardcore partisans on either side or committed voters on either side are going to vote for their person no matter what. In fact, I saw some research done about this yesterday that was pretty interesting. There was a poll taken recently that showed that something like of registered voters something like 50% were committed to voting for Biden no matter what. And then I think it was, or no, 47%. And then something like 41% or worse, or no, it was, I think 50% were committed to voting for Biden no matter what. And something like 37% were committed to voting for Trump no matter what. And then there's only this 13% range that's undecided. And what that says to me is that our society is so polarized. As I said, people are just going to vote for their party, regardless of who the candidate is. You know, it could be a ventriloquist dummy and they'll vote for their party. There is this small group of people in the middle that's somewhat undecided. And they may be in the category that the Hidden Tribes study a few years ago said are the politically disengaged. And that is people who are just generally cynical about institutions, not so much that they necessarily walk away from institutions altogether and don't vote ever or anything like that, but they're a swing voter group that has a fairly disdainful view of the process. It may actually be those people that end up deciding the election, and from what I saw, a slight majority of those were leaning more towards Biden than towards Trump. A president can also get elected or reelected without performing well in a debate. In 1984, I saw the debate between President Reagan and Walter Mondale. And President Reagan performed terribly in that debate. I remember thinking at the time, I wasn't particularly political myself at the time, but I remember thinking, wow, he's just terrible. But he still won 49 out of 50 states. So that's not necessarily a decisive factor. Now, of course, the society is much different now than it was 36 years ago. There's been a strong cultural shift leftward, I think, and as well as much wider class divisions have developed. So I tend to look at it like that's probably going to be the decisive factor. People are going to generally vote for their party no matter what. I think the big thing that each of the two parties have to really focus on is making sure their side comes out to vote. And then there's going to be this narrow slither of swing voters that could go either way. I really don't see them canceling the election or anything like that. That's just, as we've talked about, that's just too far out in terms of delegitimizing the whole process. I haven't really paid a lot of attention to what's going on the Democratic side at this point in terms of the war between the neoliberals and the left. I have been watching what's been going on among the Republicans. It seems like the Republicans are starting to fragment between these, the people on the ground, where Trump, I think, has something like a 90+% approval rating among rank and file Republicans. But then you have these other Republicans that are these more elite Republicans that are going over to the Democrats. You have guys like Bill Kristol and George Will and this Lincoln Project and people like that are embracing the Democrats. And I think a lot of that is just sheer opportunism. I think they look at it like the Republican Party is shrinking over the long run because of its base is dying out demographically. They may think there's if they want to be recognized media pundits and stuff like that, they may think that being a never Trumper is the way to go. But it does seem that the Republicans are fragmenting as well as the Democrats are fragmenting. It seems to me, though, that the Democrats have largely been successful in marginalizing the more radical elements in their own party, and to a large degree co-opting them. I think that that's something that the Democratic leadership has been able to do very well. They've been able to deflect radicals in their own ranks, and co-opting them in the process. And what they seem to do, what their strategy, I think, obviously is, as far as the Democratic Party leadership, is they want to keep economic radicals at bay. Like, I've noticed that Biden really hasn't endorsed any of the more social democratic type of proposals that Sanders and people like that have put forward. At the same time, I think the co-optation effort is going to come from all of this wokeness stuff. I suspect that a Biden administration would be very heavy on ethnic quotas and gender quotas and gay quotas and appointing lots of people representing diversity to all kinds of positions and things like that, and reinstating the rule about public school systems and transgender restrooms. I think is going to be the core weapon that the Democrats use to make sure that they can maintain the loyalty of their culturally left-wing base, and co-opt the radicals within their own rank. I think the last thing they want is to try to give any platform to the more economic radicals, and they've been able to do that pretty well, I think. So I think that will probably continue to be a winning strategy for them. And I think the reason why is because the left is just so phobic about the right. I mean, they have this, I call it right-wingophobia, or pathological right-wingophobia, because to hear the left tell the story, you think that of course, every election it's like the Republicans, whoever they are the second coming of Hitler. So that's a powerful weapon that the Democrats have that they can manipulate the left with.
Yeah, Swithin, your thoughts?
I think it would be interesting what would the Democratic Party will do if Biden loses, because then it'd be a big question as to whether they can keep the economic leftists at bay after screwing over Sanders twice. Will they be able to stop a more economic leftwards shift of the Democratic Party? That will be interesting. It'll depend upon how important economics is relative to culture amongst the Democratic vote base, because what could happen, there's with the current political analysis that seems quite interesting, is the idea that we're split on sort of two issues, both in the US and the UK, which is primarily cultural and kind of economic to some extent. And what you have now is that some on the more corporate left are actually more favorable towards quote unquote more free market economics than some on the right. You could make the argument that right-wing populism is basically a form of conservative collectivism of a certain degree. So if well, they probably wouldn't, because they'll despise Trump, but the Republican Party could end up turning into some sort of moderate national collectivist party and basically sap away any economic radicalism. Not because the Democrats do it themselves, it's just that the ones who are more interested in economics get pulled over to the Republicans. Now, if the people who do that, though, you could make the case are probably likely to be older and older Democratic voters, and whether over time that's going to be plausible is another question, because they would be less concerned on they'd be more concerned about the leftist cultural stuff. But I say it would be interesting to see what happens, what the Democrats do if Biden happens to lose, because you might think that the economic leftists would come out in force again and go, well, we just weren't giving the free stuff around, we weren't taxing the rich enough. With respect to the was it, I think he said like 13% who are undecided, whether or not they watch debates or not, I do think competency of candidates probably would, on purely a sort of quote unquote professional level, is like whether they can do the job or not. I think those are people who would be more concerned about ability in that sense than would the diehard Democratic or Republican supporters. And so I think with respect to a debate, if Biden just looks completely out of it, I do think that would weigh against that middle 13% from voting for him. Also, with respect to the polarization of the camps, I haven't looked at any historical data. Would it be interesting to see how many people were very definitely going to vote for either the Republicans or the Democrats, say 30 or 40 years ago? I imagine the proportions were still relatively high, not necessarily for the same reasons they are today, but electoral politics is kind of American football for the middle class to a large extent. And so, well, it's just what, we're, everyone in this area, everyone in the place I work, or Democrat, or we'll vote Democrat too. You know, it's just kind of what you do. And then, of course, you always get the bizarre situations like I don't know if the Democrats have as much, but the Labour Party in the UK have to some extent. You basically have people who you might think are more at home in like the Conservative Party being Labour MPs. I mean, they've been pretty much shifted out by now. But you had ones of relatively, well, to be fair, traditionally the Labour Party were quite culturally conservative. But they're kind of people like, well, we want to help what you might refer to as the deserving poor, but we're not really about for giving free stuff to everybody. Uh,
We're losing you, Swithun. So while we're waiting for Swithun,
so hello, am I still going?
Yeah, okay.
Todd, am I still all right?
Yeah.
Right. So it'd be interesting, let's say historically, to see how dyed-in-the-wool Democrats and Republican voters were. So because I do think that the polarization point, whilst I think they are more polarized, well, I think they are possibly on substantive issues to some extent, but as to whether they are more polarized in support for their party, I think is a different question.
Yeah. So, right, Ruminations, your thoughts?
Well, I think that it's very difficult to imagine Biden winning for the reason that has been said earlier, that it's difficult to imagine anyone who voted for Trump switching over to vote for Biden at this point. It really does seem like the only thing that Biden really has to recommend for himself is that he isn't Donald Trump, that he is a Democrat, so he's sort of held up as this sort of puppet, which is the non-Donald Trump option. That being said, I also take Keith's point that for a lot of these people, it really is like a tribal loyalty. They're not looking at the candidates and thinking, well, Biden has 5 points on his platform that I like, and Donald Trump only has 4. No, they're thinking in terms of the ultimate direction, which faction they want to see succeed in this election. That being said, I don't trust the polls at all. And that's not just because they happen to not work out in 2016. It seems to be more simply because mathematics, as it's used by the media now, seems to be eminently, or to have become eminently meaningless. Like if you look at the death counter for COVID, for example, it's incredibly contradictory. It's basically at the point where, when it comes to things like polls and death counters and things, it really is one step away from them coming out and saying, well, here are the numbers you'd like to see. We publish your favorite numbers every day. And so I don't really take those all that seriously, nor do I think that they're plausible, given that there are some moderates left, there are some fence sitters. I just think that anyone who even has a modicum of social skills would just look at the situation and think, well, that Trump may say bizarre things. He may seem to be sort of an off-kilter person, but the idea that we would vote for this dementia patient who's hiding in a bunker with all of these crazed lunatics screaming that if you don't vote for him, that you're voting for Hitler. I think that just that entire situation will scare a lot of people, understandably so. Now, the only thing that makes that uncertain, of course, is the fact that the supporters of the Democratic left, the hardcore supporters, are so determined, they are so invested in that position, that of course none of that will matter. Now, something that I said a moment ago may have been misunderstood, in that I'm not saying that it's visibly or obviously so that social justice culture is dissipating. and in many ways, of course, it is more explicit than it was. If you look at that Smithsonian museum statement about the all of the traits, the vicious traits that are associated with white supremacy, and like showing up on time and having a good work ethic and things of that nature, that's obviously an intensification from 2016. Likewise, the fact that after we have just been told that people can't go to church or do anything, and then suddenly it's actually good to protest during a virus if it's in the name of fighting white supremacy, and that won't really cause the numbers to go up. That's fine. Like that is obviously very in your face. That's an intensification of the politically correct culture. What I am picking up on is that in subtle ways, there is at least an interpretation that we're seeing the beginning of a temporary dissipation. What I mean is that in 2016, 2017, you could not talk to anyone, go anywhere that was moderately left liberal without them saying, now you can use whichever bathroom you want, and with people sort of initiating conversations about Donald Trump, like very, very this kind of aura in the air of just constant anal retentive, just grating soft totalitarianism every single step. Now it feels much more desperate. It's much more in your face. But when I talk to ordinary people, or you walk into an ordinary, let's say, doctor's office or whatever, there's a feeling in which of people becoming very tired of this. And I don't mean right-wing people. I mean left liberal people. Like I know people who were in to social justice warrior culture, who were against Trump, Bernie Sanders supporters, this kind of thing, who now that they are living through a virus, living through woke capitalism, living through riots and so forth, suddenly something like refund the police does not seem all that egregious. I'll admit that this is a subjective interpretation, but then again, the unpleasantness of 2016, 2017 woke culture, that was also subjective. Our internalization of that, our distaste for that culture does have a subjective element. And what I'm saying is that with not among the elites, but among average people, there is a sense that you're more likely to get a receptive reaction from the average person if you complain about these things than you would have if you complained about them in, say, 2016. That's a very difficult thing to quantify or demonstrate, but that's more of what I was getting at with that. But I think that's one of the things that's going to help with Trump being reelected, is that I think that what's left of the normies or the ordinary centrist type people are not immune to the perception that the world has gone completely insane.
Yeah, I think one of the key elements that makes 2020 so unprecedented and puts so many people on edge, regardless of their political position, is just we've touched on this before in other streams, but the complete schizophrenia with regard to COVID. So for like the first phase from when the outbreak until George Floyd, everybody had to shut down. Everybody had to stay home. You know, if you didn't wear a mask, you were going to kill people, and everybody had to do it. And then all of a sudden, overnight, a whole demographic of the population can go out in public, quote unquote, spread the disease, and it's okay. You know, churches aren't allowed to open, but you can protest. And it's for the most petty reasons. And there becomes this complete Twilight Zone idea where what actually is reality? Like what reality are we living in? Did two, fictional universes collide? People are at the point where it's like, what is even true anymore? Like, it's not like they've changed their political positions. It's that what can even be trusted? What can even be understood? And this tremendous amount of ennui, angst, and uncertainty is, I think, really unprecedented on a national level and really plays into all the chaos and uncertainty we have for the rest of the year. Do you have anything you want to mention about that, Keith?
Yeah, I think that the response we've seen by public health officials to COVID, it has really served to discredit the medical and scientific establishment. I think that perhaps previously was one aspect of the establishment that many people continued to trust because they were thinking, well, medicine and science, they're supposed to be value neutral, just about facts. But we see that no, even those institutions are politically driven now. One thing that you didn't mention was the about face that they did on wearing masks when the COVID pandemic first started. They were saying, no, don't worry about wearing masks. Just leave those for the healthcare workers. Which I mean, my thought at the time is, well, if masks are no good, then why do healthcare workers need them? Why does anybody need a mask? So I figured something was up with that. And then they eventually turned around and said, well, actually, we lied about that, but we had a good cause for doing so. But now, yeah, definitely wear a mask. And then, as you said, but then they did another about face when they were saying, all of a sudden, it went from you can't go to weddings, you can't go to funerals, you can't go to church, but you can go out in mosques and protest in the street with, thousands of people. That's okay. And then there was a surge in the virus early afterwards in terms of the number of cases, and then the media was constantly saying, "Oh, but it had nothing to do with the protest. That didn't do anything to contribute to the resurgence of the virus. It was all just about people going to the beach when they shouldn't have and things like that." So this completely dishonest propaganda that we've gotten about this situation is, I think, clearly is rattled a lot of people. The other thing about that, though, is that I do think that the virus issue, the COVID-19 issue, is interestingly become just another culture war issue, and people base their opinions on issues related to the pandemic based on their political affiliation. I see that all the time. I see that on social media and internet news sites and stuff like that. If you're on the right, you're supposed to say, well, the pandemic's really not that bad, or they're exaggerating its threat, or the public health officials are incompetent morons and they want to wreck the economy. And then if you're on the left, you're supposed to say, well, this idiot Donald Trump, he blundered the response to the pandemic. And you have all these right-wing idiots that are out there saying they're not going to wear masks because they've got this retrograde 18th century don't tread on me philosophy or whatever. It's just become another culture war issue like anything else, and people base their opinions on what is essentially a medical and scientific issue on political affiliation. So I don't know that that's really going to change any of the dynamics of the wider political polarization that we see. And I think every issue like that in the future is going to be I mean, like I saw a lecture online yesterday by a guy named James Lindsay, who was he was one of these new atheist Sam Harris type people, but now he's a outspoken critic of the whole social justice phenomena and critical race theory and white fragility and all these terms they keep coming up with. Now, one thing he points out is that the issue with the social justice movement is they make everything political. They make mathematics political. They make Dungeons and Dragons political. They make sports political. They make bird watching and stamp collecting political. They take this whole postmodern idea of the personal is political and amplify it many times over. And that in turn is shaping how people see everything. People who adhere to this point of view see everything through that particular lens. I do think that what was mentioned before about people getting aggravated with this stuff and walking away from it is an issue. More and more, I am starting to see, for example, YouTube channels by people who say, well, I used to be on the hard left, or I used to be a social justice warrior, but now I've moved away from that, and I might even vote for Trump this time around. I've seen people who are not stereotypical quote unquote conservatives or Republicans or anything like that taking that kind of attitude. And in fact, there has been a movement like that, like the walk away, and some of the stuff that you see on Dave Rubin's program, where he has all these ex-liberals or ex-Democrats or ex-leftists or whatever, who've supposedly moved rightward. Although I think the impact of that tendency, if it becomes very large or very active, is that it will have a liberalizing effect on the right. You'll have all these, it'll be kind of like the impact the neocons had on the right in the United States, where you had all these ex-hard leftists who went over to the right for whatever reason and essentially pushed the right to the left. I think that the whole walk away phenomena could certainly have that effect as well. So where in the future the right is really just liberalism and the left is this social justice warrior stuff, postmodern, cultural Marxist, whatever it is. And I think that probably that may be the way in which our whole discourse is eventually shaped in the future. Now, as far as someone like Tucker Carlson, it's true that his program is popular in the sense of being the most popular cable news program, but I think that's somewhat misleading because there's not that many people who really get their news from cable news anymore, except older people. I'm fairly old. I'm 53, but I don't even have a TV. I don't even watch cable. I will watch excerpts of some cable programs on YouTube or something like that. But I get most of my news from social media and alternative media and all that kind of the internet. The Fox News's average audience is something like 60 something. People in their 60s and upward. So if you only have middle-aged and older people watching TV nowadays, or at least watching cable news, then it's not surprising that a show like Tucker's would get, it would be that popular. But it's relative to the actual pool that he's got to draw from in terms of an audience.
All right, Swithun.
I do think the relationship between the populations and the health establishment is going to be interesting, as Keith pointed out, given the massive U-turns and bends and here, there, and everywhere with it. This, I think, will become particularly important. Now, I don't know if it is in the US, but it does seem that the unspoken strategy in the UK, at least, is to unleash compulsory vaccinations if and when they get something they claim works, which will be interesting. I believe the last time they had a compulsory vaccine in England was the smallpox vaccine in the 19th century. So the relationship between the medical establishment and the population will be interesting. I think this will especially be the case. Well, you could say this is because of my political position. When it turns out that the numbers make no sense and they knew this for a long time. So, for example, in the UK, may or may not have heard this. If you've ever tested positive for coronavirus and then die, you're recorded as the coronavirus death. So you can recover from coronavirus 3 months ago being hit by a bus, and then you're recorded as a coronavirus death. And only recently has, what the heck, the guy called Hancock, can't remember his first name, Matt Hancock, who's the health secretary. He's like, oh no, we're going to do an investigation into this now. It's like, yeah, Matt, I think you knew this a while ago, but you didn't investigate it. So I think that is going to be particularly interesting. Although you could make the defense of the medical establishment that, well, they make scientific statements which then the political establishment used to hide their decision making behind. Although I do think that's a little too kind on the medical establishment. That said, with respect to different political positions determining your view on coronavirus, I still think that, or at least from what I've seen, the people who are generally sort of skeptical of the response are quite small and a minority, much less than the sort of Tory party, Labour Party divide in the UK. I think it was about 20% or something like that, maybe 25% max. And of interest as well with numbers, even the people who were in the frustrated camp, this was from King's College London, they estimated that the likelihood of being hospitalized from coronavirus was 20%. And this is the people who are like the most skeptical in the groups that they put in, when hospitalization is at best 1%, obviously depending on who you are. So yeah, the shakedown of that, I think largely just with the whole coronavirus thing, I think it comes down to personality. And we discussed this with the personality in politics. I think people are generally like, well, you know, risk exists. I'll take risks. That's fine. They're generally like, coronavirus is crazy. Like, why are we responding like this? It makes no sense. Whereas the people who are generally of a more nervous disposition are like, oh yes, we should lock down everything to make sure that there is no possibility of dying ever. Now, that could very well correlate with political positions, but I do think to a large extent, the coronavirus stuff is a personality response more than anything else.
Okay, Ruminations.
Well, my summary of all of this is that I think that the powers that be have shot themselves in the foot with trying to encourage all of this radicalism while simultaneously trying to suppress a lot of contrary radicalism on the right, precisely because in the age of social media, which they've largely had a hand in bringing about and pushing, and also in the era of sort of self-induced individualistic anti-totalitarianism that kind of comes from, say, the 1990s or whatever, when you had left liberals patting themselves on the back because they would even be willing to speak to Hitler or whatever it is that they like to say. And also, I think just the general premises by which the left came to power in the 1960s are the same. That reality is the same thing that's keeping them from now taking power to the extent that they would like to, right? Once you've brought this reality of the internet, of alternative media, of protest culture, all of this into play, and you've told everyone that they're an individual and how totalitarianism is an unspeakable evil and so forth, it's very difficult for you to then become a totalitarian over the people who you've trained to think like that. And I think that's a large part of why they're having a difficult time gracefully dealing with all of this, because they helped to make people as uncooperative as they have become. Like, I cannot imagine people lining up for polio vaccines the way they did in say the 1950s today. So I think that what the real synthesis that will come out of this, where this is going.
Oh my, we lost Ruminations. So yeah, it is rather interesting, but I think at this point we need to wrap up. So again, thanks everyone for appearing. Sorry we lost Ruminations again. This is Todd Lewis.